Dreams of a drowning island haunted Alara's sleep. She was a young scholar of Númenor, a keeper of her people's long history, but the knowledge she sought was forbidden. Deep within the royal library, hidden from the eyes of the king's guard, lay an ancient stone tablet. Its weathered surface held a prophecy, a whispered warning of the kingdom's downfall. Driven by a need to understand the visions that plagued her, Alara made a fateful choice. She would translate the tablet, risking everything, her position, her safety, even exile, to uncover the truth before pride sealed their fate. By the end of this story, you will witness one individual's courage against the tides of destiny and discover how the smallest hope can endure the greatest loss. What secrets did the tablet hold that could unravel a civilization, and could one person's understanding change the course of history? Where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? I always find it wonderful to picture the different places and moments this story finds a home. Dust fell away from the ancient stone under Alara's careful touch. Her fingers traced the cool, carved lines, and as they did, a soft blue light began to pulse within the grooves. The script was no longer inert. It shimmered, rearranging itself before her widening eyes into something entirely new, a delicate, glowing map of the island's western coast, pointing toward a place named only as the Shrine of Echoes. A low, deep hum resonated through the library floor, a vibration more felt than heard. From somewhere beyond the towering shelves, the distinct, measured cadence of a guard's boots began to echo, growing steadily louder. Alara's breath caught. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to vanish before she was found in this forbidden corner, but her eyes remained locked on the luminous lines of the map. This was not just text, it was a path. To flee now would be to lose it forever. She forced her racing heart to still, her mind to become a blank slate, and she began to memorize. The curve of the bay, the placement of the standing stones, the path through the whispering woods. She burned each detail into her memory, an act of quiet defiance against the approaching danger. The footsteps were in the adjacent aisle now. With a final, desperate glance, she turned and slipped into a narrow service passage she had used only once before, the darkness swallowing her just as a tall figure rounded the corner. She was safe for a moment, but the quiet scholar was gone. In her place was a woman with a secret powerful enough to shatter the kingdom's pride. A secret that now compelled her toward a destination everyone else had been taught to fear. The whispering woods lived up to their name. Alara stepped from the solid ground of Númenor into a world of shifting mist and muted sound, where the very air seemed to swallow her footsteps. Gnarled roots twisted up from the damp earth like the bones of the earth itself, and an eerie silence pressed in on all sides, broken only by the soft rustle of unseen things. Her journey was a solitary one, guided solely by the luminous map etched into her mind. As she moved deeper, her scholarly eyes, trained for texts and tablets, now scanned the forest floor for sustenance. She gathered pale, edible mushrooms from the bases of ancient trees and plucked hardy, bitter greens that would sustain her body, if not calm her spirit. The act was grounding, a small rebellion against the overwhelming strangeness of this place. Then, a flicker of movement and a pained whimper broke the stillness. A fox, its coat the color of autumn leaves, lay tangled in a thicket of thorny vines, one hind leg held at an awkward angle. Alara's first thought was of the map, of the precious time this would cost. Every moment spent was a moment the king's guard closed in. Yet, to leave a creature in suffering felt like a betrayal of the very truth she sought. Kneeling in the damp loam, she worked with careful hands, her touch gentle, as she freed the animal and used a strip of cloth from her tunic to bind its wounded leg. The delay felt like an eternity, her anxiety a live wire under her skin. The fox, once free, did not bolt. It simply watched her with dark, intelligent eyes, then limped a few paces and looked back, waiting. A profound conflict stirred within Alara. The logical part of her, the scholar, insisted the map was her only reliable guide. This creature was an unpredictable variable, a distraction. But the woods themselves seemed to be a living deception, with paths that appeared and vanished in the mist, disorienting her senses. The map was a picture of the land, but the fox was of the land. Trusting it felt like a leap into the unknown, a surrender of control she had always clung to. With a final, hesitant glance at the mental image of her charted course, she made her choice. She would follow the fox. It was a decision born not of logic, but of a dawning trust in the world beyond books, a belief that intuition could be as sharp a tool as knowledge. The fox led her along a path she would have never chosen, a narrow route that skirted the edge of a deep ravine. It was only as they passed that the wind shifted, carrying up from the shadows below a low, guttural growl and the pungent scent of a creature whose territory she had been about to blunder into. A cold dread washed over her, the realization, a stark lesson. Her compassion had not weakened her journey, it had safeguarded it. This simple act of mercy had become her most vital survival tool. As the fox led her into a sun-dappled clearing, the tension in her shoulders began to ease, and there, nestled between the roots of two great, intertwined trees, was a single, moss-covered stone, its surface marked with the same ancient script as the library tablet. The first marker of the Shrine of Echoes promised answers, but standing in that quiet clearing, Alara felt the weight of a new question. What other guardians, both seen and unseen, waited for her in the heart of the woods? The stone marker was merely a precursor. Pushing deeper into the clearing, Alara found the shrine itself, a low, circular structure of pale stone, almost completely swallowed by thick, ropey vines. It felt less like a building and more like something that had grown from the earth, a secret the forest had agreed to keep. Her hands, still tender from freeing the fox, now worked to pull the vegetation away, tearing at the stubborn growth until the ancient stone was bare. Beneath the green curtain, a story was carved. She saw the image of a great star and figures with features both human and elven raising a white tree together. This was the founding of Númenor, a gift from the powers of the West for their loyalty in a great conflict of a prior age. The carvings spoke of a covenant, a sacred agreement of friendship and reverence that bound her people to the Eldar and the Valor. The air around the shrine hummed with a profound and ancient peace, a memory of that first, unbroken dawn. Driven by an impulse she did not fully understand, Alara reached out and laid her palm upon the central altar stone. The moment her skin touched the cool rock, a soft warmth bloomed beneath her hand. The carvings across the shrine began to glow with a gentle, golden light, and then the air itself shimmered. A luminous history unfolded before her, not as still images, but as a living tapestry of light and shadow. She saw the early days of Númenor, its people learning shipcraft from the elves, their sails like white petals on the water. But the vision shifted. She watched as later generations of her people, their ships growing ever larger and their towers reaching higher, began to turn away from the slender elven vessels. The shared celebrations became fewer, the exchanges of knowledge ceased. A shadow of pride and isolation fell over the island, a deliberate turning inward and a resentment of the very gifts that had founded their kingdom. The hum in the air grew strained, a dissonant chord of sorrow and warning. The light from the shrine was a beacon in the dim woods, and the spectral echoes of the past whispered, loud enough to be heard. Every second, she stood there bathed in that glow was a risk, a signal to any guard or hunter who might be nearby. She had to be swift. Her journal was in her hands in an instant, its pages open. Instead of fleeing, she began to sketch the key symbols from the vision, the white tree, the star, the broken circle that symbolized the fractured covenant. She scribbled phrases of the old tongue that echoed in the air, her hand moving rapidly. Preservation, in this moment, felt more critical than flight. This was not just history, it was evidence of a broken promise, and she was now its sole scribe. Tucking the journal safely back into her tunic, she felt the weight of it change. It was no longer a personal record, but a testament. Its existence raised the stakes immeasurably. If it were found, it would not merely mean her arrest, but the destruction of a truth the kingdom had worked so hard to erase. The political danger was now absolute. As the last of the light faded from the altar, a sudden, sharp rustle came from the bushes at the edge of the clearing. It was too close and too deliberate to be the wind. Her breath froze. In one fluid, desperate motion, she dropped low and scrambled into the deep shadows beneath the gnarled roots of the great intertwined trees, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the journal pressed to her chest. The rustle in the bushes gave way to a tall, cloaked figure who stepped into the clearing. Elara held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the earthy hollow beneath the roots, her fingers curling around the journal. The man moved with a quiet confidence, his gaze sweeping the area, not with the blunt suspicion of a guard, but with a sharp, knowing assessment. He paused before the shrine, his hand resting where hers had been only moments before, and let out a soft, weary sigh. "I know you are here," he said, his voice low and calm, carrying no threat. "My name is Kalin. I am a ranger of the western marches, and I too have been listening to the whispers of this land. They are growing faint." Elara remained frozen, her mind racing. This could be an elaborate trap, a hunter using honeyed words to lure his prey from hiding. Yet his presence at the shrine, his recognition of its significance, felt genuine. "The king's pride blinds him to the slow fading of our grace," Kalin continued, still addressing the silent woods. "He sees strength in our towering ships and our walls of stone, but he is deaf to the old music that once sustained us. I have seen the signs, the withering of certain trees, the silence of certain shores. I believe you have seen them too." Cautiously, Elara emerged from her hiding place, her own posture tense and ready for flight. "How can I trust you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Your word could be a snare." Kalin turned to face her fully, his expression open. "Then do not trust my words. Trust what we both have witnessed. This shrine would not have shown its heart to one who serves the king's current will." The air between them was thick with unspoken risk. To involve another person was to double the danger, to share a secret that could now condemn two souls instead of one. Yet, the prospect of continuing her quest entirely alone, with the entire might of the kingdom potentially arrayed against her, felt like a different kind of doom. After a long, measured silence, Elara made her choice. She would test the waters. She spoke not of the library tablet or the glowing map in her mind, but of the carvings on the shrine itself, describing the imagery of the white tree and the star. She shared a single, carefully chosen phrase from her journal, a line about the covenant that was common enough in old texts to be deniable, yet specific enough to gauge his reaction. Kalin listened intently, and when she finished, he nodded slowly, a look of profound understanding in his eyes. He recognized the reference, and his interpretation aligned perfectly with her own. This small, shared understanding became the fragile foundation of their alliance. "The path forward is not here in these woods," he said, his tone now decisive. "We must seek one who remembers. There is an Eldar in a small coastal village to the north, a woman who knew the elves when they still visited our shores. She may help us understand the full meaning of your visions. The sea, the very source of Númenor's power and its growing arrogance, now called to them." With a final glance at the silent shrine, they turned together, two conspirators against the coming shadow, their footsteps now set toward the murmur of the waves and the memory of a friendship the world had forgotten. The scent of salt and old wood greeted them long before the village came into view. Lorellen was a small clutch of weathered homes clinging to the cliffs, its people moving with the tired, practiced rhythm of those who live by the moods of the sea. Elara and Kalin did not arrive as scholars or rangers, but as humble travelers. They offered their hands to the work, sitting with the fishermen on the sun-bleached docks, their fingers learning the intricate knots and weaves of the nets. It was through this shared labor, this quiet offering of help, that the villagers began to speak. Their stories were not of grand history, but of a present unease. They spoke of strange currents that tore nets, of fish swimming deeper than ever before, and of a silence that had fallen over the western waters, where the songs of certain seabirds were once a constant comfort. The sea, their lifelong provider, was growing restless, and its discontent was felt in every mended rope and worried glance. This shared hardship was the key that unlocked a guarded door. Their willingness to listen, to truly hear the worries of the people, earned them a cautious audience with Elder Valendil. The Elder's home was a small hut, filled with the scent of drying herbs and old memories. Valendil himself was a man whose face was a map of sun and time, his eyes holding a deep, weary knowledge. He was polite but distant, his posture a clear shield against the outside world and the king's influence. He listened to their initial explanations with a skeptical silence, his gaze lingering on Elara, weighing the intent behind her words. She felt the opportunity slipping away, the door of his trust closing before it had even fully opened. The urgency of her mission pressed against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the Elder's calm reserve. She knew she had to risk a greater truth. With a respectful but firm tone, she began to speak not just of old tales, but of the specific symbols she had seen: the star, the white tree, the fractured circle of the covenant. She wove the words from the shrine's vision into her plea, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The tension in the small hut was a palpable force. Valendil's wariness was a wall, and Alara's knowledge was a key that did not quite fit the lock. She faced a critical choice. To speak further was to risk sounding like a fanatic, but to hold back was to fail. Taking a slow breath, she made her decision. She reached into her tunic and brought out her journal. It was an act of profound vulnerability, placing the physical evidence of her treason, her most dangerous possession, into the hands of a man she had just met. She opened it to the pages she had sketched in the woods, the symbols glowing with the meaning she had imbued them with. She laid it on the table between them, a silent offering of trust that could either secure their most powerful ally or deliver her directly to the king's justice. The elder's reaction was immediate and profound. His breath caught, and a tremor passed through his hand as he reached out, not to take the journal, but to gently trace the drawn lines of the star and the tree. The practiced skepticism in his eyes shattered, replaced by a raw, shocked recognition. It was not the look of a man seeing interesting old lore, but of a man witnessing the return of a long-lost truth. This confirmation changed everything. Alara's quest was no longer a solitary, personal search for answers. The authenticity of the tablet, now validated by this elder's deep cultural memory, transformed their mission into something far greater. It was now a race for the very soul of Númenor, a fight against the erosion of their shared identity. The stakes had escalated from personal survival to cultural survival. Valendil looked from the journal to Alara's earnest face, and then to Kalin's steady gaze. The final layer of his reserve melted away, moved by the sincerity of their risk and the weight of the truth they carried. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and thick with emotion. "There is a place," he said, "a cove hidden from the casual eye, where the water is clear as glass, and the stones remember what the land has forgotten. I will take you there. The sea does not only bring change, it also holds memories for those who know how to listen." The path Valendil led them down was not a path at all, but a narrow fissure in the cliffside, hidden behind a cascade of flowering vines. The roar of the ocean grew to a thunderous pitch as they descended into the cold, damp dark. They were entering the singing caves. At first, there was only the drip of water and the distant crash of waves. Then, as they moved deeper into the cavern, a low hum began to vibrate through the soles of their boots. It was not one sound, but many, a complex, layered resonance that seemed to emanate from the very stone. Valendil raised a hand for silence. "Listen," he whispered. "The walls remember." With a deep, resonant tone, the elder hummed a single, clear note. The cave answered. The harmonic echoes did not merely repeat his sound, they built upon it, weaving a tapestry of auditory memory. The notes shifted, becoming the sound of joyful voices raised in song, the strains of elven harps, and the cadence of a shared language. The caves were not just singing, they were recounting. They told of the first meetings on these shores, of the Eldar teaching the people of Númenor to rid the stars in new ways, of gifts of knowledge and deep, abiding friendship. The air itself shimmered with the ghost of that connection, a palpable sense of loss and longing for a time when two peoples were not divided by sea and suspicion. But the caves held a danger as tangible as their beauty. As Alara moved closer to a wall covered in crystalline formations, her foot dislodged a small stone. The resulting clatter created a dissonant frequency. Immediately, a shower of pebbles and dust rained down from the ceiling nearby, a sharp warning that the cave's stability was tied to their harmony. They had to move with deliberate care, their every footstep and breath a potential disruption to the fragile equilibrium. The song reached a crescendo, and within its complex melody, a specific pattern emerged, a sequence of tones and a series of symbolic gestures performed in harmony with the earth's own music. This was the ritual of reaffirmation, a ceremonial practice designed to honor the bond with the Eldar and acknowledge the gifts of the valor. It was a living prayer, long forgotten by the kingdom. Alara's mind, trained for retention, knew that memory alone was not enough for something this precise. This was a key, a tangible act that could mend the broken covenant. As the song continued its cycle, she made a decision. She opened her journal to a fresh page, her hand moving swiftly. She did not write words, but musical notation, capturing the rising and falling melody as best she could. Beside the staves, she sketched the ritual steps, a hand raised to the sky, a palm placed upon the heart, a knee bent to the earth. She was transcribing hope itself onto the page, creating a manual for salvation that stood in direct defiance of the king's isolationist decrees. The weight of what they had discovered was immense. This was no longer just about understanding the past. It was about changing the future. Performing this ritual could be a beacon, a way to remind the land and its people of their true heritage, and potentially avert the catastrophic downfall whispered in the prophecy. Yet, to even speak of it was an act of political rebellion. Their mission had escalated from a search for truth to a desperate race to enact it. As the final echoes of the cave's song faded into a soft, lingering hum, they emerged from the cliffside fissure, blinking in the late afternoon sun. The revelation filled them with a fragile, determined hope, but that hope was instantly tempered by a cold dread. There, on the horizon, its white sail, a stark slash against the blue sea, was a royal ship. It was not heading for the tiny village, but its presence was a piercing reminder. They were being watched, and the kingdom's power stretched as far as the eye could see. The news from the capital struck like a physical blow. King Ar-Pharazôn, in a speech that echoed through the grand plazas, declared his intention to build a fleet unlike any seen before, a great armada to sail west and challenge the very powers who had gifted them their island. It was not ambition, it was an act of open defiance against the ban of the Valor. In the coastal village, the celebration that erupted was a fractured, nervous thing. Some cheered the king's boldness, their voices loud with a feverish pride, while others stood in silent fear, their eyes turned toward the horizon as if expecting a storm. For Alara, the dread was a cold stone in her stomach. The prophecy was no longer a distant warning, it was unfolding before them, accelerated by the king's own hand. Time, which had felt like a resource, was now a flame burning swiftly to its end. She stood at a precipice of choice, to continue her work in secret, preserving the ritual from the caves, felt like a quiet surrender. To speak out, to approach someone within the labyrinth of power, was to risk everything she had worked for. Her journal, hidden against her heart, felt heavier than ever. It contained not just secrets, but a potential path away from ruin. After a night of tormented thought, She made her decision. She would seek out Lady Irima, a member of the King's Council, renowned for her wisdom and her moderate voice, a woman who had often spoken of the value of the old ways. It was a desperate gamble. To reveal herself to any counselor, no matter how sympathetic, was to step directly into the political arena where a single misstep could lead to a prison cell. The stakes were no longer just her own safety or the preservation of knowledge. They were national, even spiritual. The future of Númenor's soul now hinged on a clandestine conversation. Her message was sent through a trusted, discreet network of Valendil's contacts. The reply came not in writing, but as a whispered instruction for a meeting in a secluded garden at the 10th hour. When Eldar arrived, her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Lady Irima was waiting, her posture regal, but her eyes shadowed with concern. She listened as Eldar spoke, her expression unreadable as the young scholar carefully laid out the core of her discovery, the broken covenant and the ritual of reaffirmation. When Eldar finished, the silence stretched thin. "I believe your heart is true," the lady said finally, her voice barely a murmur, "and the truth you carry is a burden I would not wish on anyone. But you must understand, the king's eyes and ears are not just in the court. They are in the streets, in the markets, perhaps even among those you think are friends. Trust is a luxury we can no longer afford." Her words did not bring comfort, but a chilling confirmation. The paranoia was not imagined. It was a fundamental condition of the world they now inhabited. The meeting ended with a promise of nothing more than the lady's continued consideration, a fragile thread of hope. As Eldar slipped back into the shadows, she felt more exposed than ever. She had cast a stone into the still waters of the court, and now she had to wait, watching the ripples, unsure if they would bring a rescuing hand or a grasping net. The hidden garden was a pocket of stillness, its air thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and whispered treason. Under the soft glow of lantern light, 4 figures formed a fragile circle. Eldar, Kalin, Lady Irima, and Elder Valendil had risked everything to be here, their faces etched with a shared understanding of the danger they now faced together. This was no longer a quest for knowledge, but the birth of a conspiracy. Their small, secret alliance was a desperate attempt to remind a proud kingdom of its forgotten soul, to rekindle the memory of its bonds with the Eldar before the king's ambition burned their world to ashes. The tension in the air was not just from fear of discovery, but from the fierce debate that erupted almost immediately. Kalin, his ranger's instincts favoring decisive action, argued for a public spectacle. "We must show them the ritual from the caves," he insisted, his voice low and urgent. "Let the people see the old magic with their own eyes. Let its power speak for itself." Lady Irima countered with the cold calculus of court politics. A public demonstration would be seen as an open challenge to the king's authority, she warned. It would be crushed before the first note faded. Our only path is to work through the existing structures of learning, to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those who still listen. Eldar listened to the arguments, her fingers tracing the worn leather of her journal. She thought of the fishermen in Lorellen, of their quiet worries and their deep, intuitive connection to the sea. Change imposed from above would be just another form of command, another echo of the king's pride. "True remembrance cannot be forced," she said, her voice calm but firm. It must be awakened. We must go to the people, not the palaces. We must reteach the old stories and sing the old songs, not as a political statement, but as a return to something they have always carried in their hearts. This quiet, grassroots effort was her chosen path, a belief that the people themselves held the key to their own salvation. In that moment, their fragile alliance solidified around her vision. But with that decision came a terrifying escalation. By forming this council, they had each signed their own warrants. They were now a target, a cell of traitors in the eyes of the crown. Any one of them could be accused. Any conversation overheard could lead to imprisonment or worse. Their lives were now currency spent for a chance to save their homes. With the garden's shadows deepening around them, they agreed on their first move. They would travel to the western shores, where Valendil's contacts whispered of growing discontent with the king's pride, and where the memory of the Eldar lingered like sea mist. It was there, among those who felt the fading grace most keenly, that they would begin their quiet work. The western shore was a raw, windswept edge of the world, where the sea crashed against dark cliffs with a sound like endless mourning. That evening, a small fire fought against the encroaching dark, its light dancing on the faces of fishermen and farmers who had gathered, drawn by quiet word and a shared unease. Alara did not stand to lecture. She sat among them, and as the flames crackled, she began to speak. She told them stories not found in the king's chronicles, tales of the Eldar, who had taught their ancestors to rid the path of the stars in the swirl of sea foam, and to understand the language of the wind in the sails. Kalin added his own accounts, describing the subtle signs of the land's fading grace, the silent groves, the springs that had run dry for no reason. He spoke of these not as mysteries, but as losses, a quiet sorrow that echoed their own. At first, the listeners were silent, their expressions guarded, but as the stories wove through the night air, something began to shift. An older fisherman, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of ropes and nets, slowly nodded. He hummed a few broken notes of a melody, a shanty his own grandfather had sung, whose words he never understood until now. Another woman recalled a tale her grandmother told of a light seen far out on the water on a moonless night, a light that was neither ship nor star. Around the fire, memory was stirring from its long sleep, not as a lesson, but as a recognition. This small revival was a fragile kind of magic, a spark of shared identity, rekindling in the salt-laced air. The moment was shattered by a voice sharp with authority. What is the purpose of this assembly? A local official, his fine tunic starkly out of place, stood at the edge of the firelight, his gaze sweeping over the group. The warmth of the gathering vanished, replaced by a sudden, icy stillness. All eyes turned to Alara, her heart hammered, and the dangerous truth of the ritual in her journal felt like a brand against her skin. To speak of the Eldar, or the valor, now would be to name their crime aloud. She had to think quickly, to redirect his suspicion without a trace of deceit. She rose, her posture calm and open. "We are sharing stories of the sea," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "We speak of the great voyages of our forebears, of the courage it takes to build a life upon the waves. We are celebrating the maritime history that makes Númenor strong." The official studied her, his eyes narrow, searching for a flicker of treason in her words. He found none. Her explanation was just plausible enough, a patriotic framing that offered him no clear reason to act. With a dismissive grunt, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness, but the threat of his presence lingered like a chill. The successful evasion was a victory, but a costly one. It proved their methods could work, that the old truths could be hidden in plain sight, and it encouraged plans for more of these secret meetings. Yet it also marked them. They were now a group of interest, their activities noted, and their future movements would be watched. As the shaken group began to disperse, a young fisher, no older than Alara herself, approached her. He kept his eyes down, his voice a whisper meant only for her. "There is a place," he murmured, "where the earth remembers. My grandfather called it the Garden of the Star." He said the gifts of the old ones were strongest there, before the king's men forgot the way. Then he melted back into the night, leaving Alara with a new name, a new destination, and the chilling certainty that their every step forward was a dance in the shadow of the crown. The Garden of the Star was a secret held in the earth. Tucked within a sheltered valley, it was a place of choked pathways and silent, silvery trees, where a particular star-shaped flower was said to bloom only for those whose hearts remembered the old bonds. Alara and Kalin found it exactly as the young fisher had described, a forgotten sanctuary sleeping under a blanket of ivy and thyme. Their work began not with grand speeches, but with quiet, patient labor. They cleared the overgrowth with their hands, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of the soil, revealing ancient stone benches and a dry, cobbled stream bed. It was humble, physical work, an act of reverence for a memory they were only just beginning to understand. As their efforts uncovered the garden's original form, a subtle change began to unfold. The star flowers, which had seemed like ordinary white blossoms in the daylight, began to emit a soft, ethereal glow as dusk settled. A profound sense of peace descended upon the clearing, a tangible quiet that seemed to soothe the very air. This gentle radiance did not go unnoticed. A few villagers, drawn by the unusual sight or a quiet pull in their spirits, ventured into the valley. They came with curiosity and left with a strange, lingering calm, their whispers carrying the garden's rediscovered magic back to their homes. This fragile peace was soon threatened. Rumors reached them that the king's builders, in their relentless expansion, had surveyed the valley for a new coastal fortress. The garden, with its strategic view of the western sea, was slated for demolition. The conflict was no longer a matter of whispered debates, but of physical preservation. The king's pride, expressed in stone and mortar, was poised to crush this living symbol of a different kind of strength. Alara faced a critical decision. To hide the garden was impossible, and to defend it as a sacred site would be an immediate declaration of treason. Her solution was one of brilliant, subtle defiance. She decided not to hide their work, but to amplify it under a harmless guise. She went to the village elders and proposed a civic beautification project, a community effort to restore a historical garden for all to enjoy. She framed it as a point of local pride, a way to create a peaceful retreat away from the clamor of the shipyards. This public-facing narrative was their shield, a perfectly reasonable activity that offered no obvious challenge to the crown, yet its true purpose hummed just beneath the surface, felt by everyone who visited. The garden's transformation into a public space escalated its significance immeasurably. It was no longer a hidden secret, but a quiet, living protest. Its very existence, maintained by the hands of the people, became a test of will, Would the king's forces tear down a place of community peace and beauty, and in doing so, reveal the harshness underlying his grand ambitions? The stakes were now public, a silent tug of war between the soul of the people and the pride of the throne. Then, a new wonder occurred. On a clear evening, as the star flowers glowed with particular intensity, a ship was sighted far offshore. It was not a Númenorian vessel, but a craft of elegant, unfamiliar design, its sails catching the last light like gray wings. It was an Elven ship, a sighting so rare many thought it a myth. For Elara and her allies, the sight filled them with a soaring, terrifying hope. Had their act of remembrance, this rekindling of a sacred place, been seen across the water? The appearance of the Eldar changed everything, turning their quiet resistance into a moment of profound, uncertain destiny. The Elven ship was a vision of grace and sorrow, its hull resting on the water like a silver leaf as its captain stepped onto the sand. Laron's eyes held the light of stars that had long since faded from Númenorian skies, and his greeting was not one of anger, but of profound, weary grief. "Why have your people turned away from the friendship that once defined this age?" he asked, his voice calm, yet cutting through the sea breeze. The small council gathered to meet him felt the immense weight of the moment. They were not just representatives, they were interpreters of a fractured reality, tasked with explaining the pride of their king to one who remembered the covenant as a living bond. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, every sense alert for the sound of royal guards. This secret meeting on the deserted beach was an act of treason that could see them all imprisoned by sunset. Laron listened to their explanations of the king's ambition and the people's growing fear, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was heavy with the risk of misunderstanding. Elara knew words were not enough. Trust had to be demonstrated, not merely described. With a glance at Kalin for reassurance, she made her choice. She stepped forward and began to perform the ritual of reaffirmation she had transcribed in the singing caves. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her voice soft as she hummed the ancient melody. It was a fragile offering, a piece of their shared history returned to its source. As the final note faded, Laron's stern demeanor softened by a fraction. "You remember the old music," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "This changes things." The stakes of their interaction soared in that instant. This was no longer just a clandestine meeting. It was potential collusion with a foreign power in the eyes of the crown. Any record of this encounter would be all the evidence the king needed to dismantle their entire movement. Yet the alternative, to do nothing and let this thread of connection snap, felt like a greater betrayal. Laron agreed to carry word of their efforts to the Eldar, a fragile thread of hope cast across the sundering seas, but his parting warning carried a new and deeper dread. "Do not think your struggle is only with the pride of men," he said. "A shadow grows in the east, a power that feeds on discord and despair. Your king's folly may be the very thing that grants its strength. Our time, and yours, grows short." His words transformed the very nature of their mission. The downfall prophesied was not a singular event, but a convergence, a kingdom tearing itself apart from within, just as a long-forgotten enemy gathered its strength in the world beyond. As the Elven ship receded into the horizon, Elara felt the weight of two looming catastrophes, one born of pride, the other of ancient malice, and their small circle of remembrance now stood as a slender bulwark against both. Whispers slithered through the corridors of power, tales of pale-faced counselors who arrived with the eastern tides and never seemed to leave the king's shadow. Kalin, his ranger's instincts bristling, knew this was a hunt of a different kind. He shed his cloak and melted into the capital's bustling streets, becoming just another face in the crowd, his eyes sharp and his movements fluid. From shadowed tavern corners and high perches overlooking palace courtyards, he watched. He saw them, the king's new advisors, their gestures too precise, their eyes holding a cold light that never warmed, even when the king laughed. Their influence was a subtle poison, a constant murmuring in the royal ear that twisted reverence for the old ways into a narrative of weakness and fear. They spoke of the Valor not as guardians, but as jealous jailers, and of the Eldar as fading spirits best forgotten. Kalin's task was fraught with peril. A single misstep, a lingering glance held a moment too long, and he would be discovered. He needed more than suspicion. He needed proof that would sway the more cautious members of their own council, those who still believed the king was merely misguided, not manipulated. His decision was methodical and dangerous. Using a small piece of charcoal and a scrap of hide, he began to sketch. He captured the sharp angles of a particular advisor's face, the unusual cut of their robes, the specific way they gathered in a secluded corner of the gardens at the same hour each day. He noted their comings and goings, creating a map not of a place, but of an influence, a tangible record of the shadow taking root in the heart of their kingdom. The evidence was undeniable. This was not merely cultural decay. It was a deliberate, targeted corruption. The stakes of their mission were instantly transformed. They were no longer just fighting to preserve memory. They were actively combating a covert enemy that sought to sever their world from its very foundation. The danger was no longer just exile, but the complete and utter subversion of their homeland. When Kalin laid his sketches before the secret council, the air grew cold. The hesitant members fell silent, their doubts shattered by the stark reality of those drawn faces. Alara studied the lines of charcoal, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. With this confirmation, she knew their quiet reminders were no longer enough. They had to make a stand, a public reclamation of their identity that this shadow could not ignore. She looked at her allies, her voice steady with a newfound resolve. "The king has announced a great festival to celebrate the fleet's completion," she said. "The entire city will be gathered in the main square, their hearts swelling with the pride he has fostered. We must use that very stage. We will perform the ritual of reaffirmation, not in a hidden garden, but before the eyes of the kingdom, a quiet act of remembrance in the heart of the noise." The great square of Armanilos was a sea of shifting colors and roaring voices. A celebration of Númenors might focused on the towering shapes of the new fleet in the harbor. Amid the spectacle, a space was cleared for performers. Alara stood with a small group of singers and dancers, her heart a frantic drum against the journal hidden in her robes. This was their moment. As the music began, it was a familiar patriotic tune, but woven into its rhythm were the subtle, specific steps Kalin had taught them, a graceful mimicry of the gestures from the singing caves. The song's lyrics spoke of the sea's bounty, but the chorus lifted into a refrain about starlight on the water and voices carried on the wind. a clear, poetic echo of the Eldar. The change was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Across the vast crowd, the roaring celebration began to soften. Faces that had been alight with fierce pride now showed a different emotion, a deep, poignant recognition. An old woman near the front began to weep silently, her hand over her heart. A fisherman, his arms crossed, nodded slowly as if hearing a truth he had long forgotten. Then, a few voices from the crowd tentatively joined the unfamiliar refrain. A dozen became a score, then 100, the melody rising not as a challenge, but as a shared memory waking from a long sleep. The wave of emotion was palpable, a current of longing that flowed back to the performers on the stage. From the high royal dais, the shift in the crowd's energy did not go unnoticed. King Ar-Pharazân's smile did not falter, but it grew rigid, a mask of stone. His eastern advisors leaned in to whisper, their sharp eyes fixed on Alara. With a nearly imperceptible gesture from one of them, a contingent of the king's guard began to move, not with haste, but with purpose, weaving through the edges of the captivated audience. Alara saw them from the corner of her eye, the glint of their armor cutting through the crowd like cold steel. Panic clawed at her throat. To complete the ritual's final, most explicit sequence, the kneel to the earth and the open-handed reach to the sky would be an undeniable act of defiance. It would give the guards the public provocation they needed to seize her and shatter the fragile connection she had just forged. She had to choose, abandon the ending and lose its power, or finish it and risk everything in a violent confrontation. In that split second, her decision was made. As the final notes of their modified song hung in the air, she did not kneel. Instead, she swept her hands upward in a fluid motion that mirrored the launching of a ship, and her voice led the performers and the crowd directly into the opening lines of Númenor's most beloved national anthem. The transition was seamless. The guards, now only paces from the stage, hesitated. They could not arrest someone for leading 1,000 voices in a song of patriotic pride. The moment of direct conflict passed, but the message had been delivered. The performance was a triumph of subtle rebellion, proving that the old truths could be whispered even in the king's own court. It ignited a fragile, defiant hope in the hearts of the people, a spark that the kingdom's isolation had not completely extinguished, but that success came at a terrible cost. They were no longer shadowy dissidents. They had shown their hand, and the king's displeasure was a cold, tangible force. As the festival ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, humming the new old melody, Lady Irima moved through the departing nobles, her face a careful mask of calm. A page in the king's livery approached her, bowed, and offered a small, sealed scroll. She took it, her hand perfectly steady, but the blood drained from her face as she read the summons. The king required her presence in the palace immediately. Their quiet influence had been noted, and the reckoning had begun. The palace throne room was a cavern of cold marble and colder judgment. King Ar-Pharazôn sat enthroned, not as a father to his people, but as a monument to their ambition, flanked by his eastern counselors whose stillness felt more threatening than any drawn sword. Alara, Kalin, and Lady Irima stood before him, the vast space amplifying their solitude. The air itself seemed to resist their every breath. The king's voice was low, but it carried through the hall with the weight of an avalanche. "You have been heard," he said, speaking of things best forgotten, singing songs that confuse the hearts of my people. Some say you have even traded whispers with those who are no longer our friends. The accusation of consorting with elves hung in the air, a treasonous charge that required no proof, only the king's belief. One of the dark advisors leaned forward, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. Division is the only harvest of such talk. The penalty for sowing discord is clear. Alara's mind raced, a scroll of dangerous truths unfurling within her. To speak of the prophecy or the ritual would be a death sentence for them all. To deny their actions entirely would be a betrayal of the hope they had just rekindled in the city square. She had to find a path between defiance and surrender, a way to speak truth without speaking treason. She chose her words as if selecting stones for a fragile bridge. She did not speak of covenants or downfall. Instead, she spoke of her deep love for the stories of Numenor's founding, of the great sea quests of their ancestors, and of the wisdom that built their first towers. "My king," she said, her voice clear and steady, "we only wish to remind the people of the strength in their own history, the very strength upon which your great fleet is built." It was a subtle appeal, framing their actions as an extension of patriotism, not a challenge to it. Kalin and Lady Irima followed her lead, each affirming their loyalty, while carefully avoiding any mention of the Eldar or the Valor. They spoke of unity and legacy, using the king's own language to shield their deeper purpose. It was a delicate and exhausting performance, a battle fought with implication and nuance under the cold gaze of the throne. Their measured responses created a pause in the room's momentum. The king, a man who understood power in all its forms, recognized a public confrontation with these particular individuals would not serve him. It would only give their ideas a louder voice. His judgment, when it came, was a cage of gilded restrictions. "You will all remain in the capital," he declared. "Your movements beyond the city walls are now forbidden, and you will host no further public gatherings. Consider your influence observed." They were spared the dungeons, but they were now prisoners in plain sight, their every step watched, their every conversation potentially overheard. Walking from the throne room felt like escaping a snare that had closed just short of their throats. The immediate danger had passed, but their world had shrunk. The open work of remembrance was now impossible. Yet, as they regrouped in the secure confines of Lady Irima's private chambers, a new resolve hardened within them. The king's attempt to isolate them had come too late. The spark they had lit in the square and in the western villages had already caught. They were not three people alone anymore. They were the center of a quiet network, a web of fishermen, farmers, and now even a few lesser nobles, all of whom carried a piece of the old truth. Their strategy had to change, not their purpose. They would work through these connections, passing messages through trusted hands, sharing the rituals and stories in homes and hidden gardens, turning their movement into a quiet whisper that could travel where they themselves could not. The confrontation had not broken them. It had simply forced their hope underground, where it would have to grow roots deep enough to withstand the coming storm. The whispers became a chorus, carried on the wind and woven into the daily rhythms of Númenor. Alara and Kalin found themselves at the heart of a quiet revolution, coordinating a network that stretched from the fishing docks to the inner circles of the capital itself. Their methods were born of necessity, A baker might pass a loaf of bread containing a message baked in cryptic symbols. A weaver's pattern, sold in the market, could hide the melody of an ancient song within its intricate knots. Meetings were held in the backs of bustling taverns or during communal work in the fields, their conversations masked by the noise of honest labor. This decentralized web was their greatest strength and their most profound vulnerability. Eldar made the difficult choice to empower others, entrusting local leaders in distant towns with the core teachings. She shared the ritual steps and the old stories, turning keepers of knowledge into teachers themselves. This diffusion of responsibility was a strategic gamble. If she or Kalin were captured, the movement could survive without them, but it also meant she could no longer oversee every detail, and a single misstep by an overeager recruit could unravel everything. The constant innovation required to stay ahead of the king's spies was a relentless drain on their focus. Just as they developed a new system of coded bird calls for communication, they would learn of a sympathizer questioned by the guard, forcing them to abandon the method and invent another. This cat and mouse game was a test of endurance, fraying their nerves and stretching their limited resources thin. The movement was now a living entity, growing beyond their direct control. Its resilience, a fragile thing built on the trust of countless individuals. Then the sky turned to iron. A storm of unnatural fury descended upon the coast, a howling tempest that tore roofs from houses and sent waves crashing over the seawalls that were meant to be unbreachable. To many, it did not feel like a simple turn in the weather. It felt like an answer, a chilling omen from the very powers the king sought to defy. The storm's fury was a living thing, tearing at the western shores with claws of wind and water. While the king's guards secured the royal docks, Eldar and her allies were already moving through the drowning villages, their small boat a defiant speck against the raging sea. They pulled families from collapsing homes, guided the elderly to higher ground, and shared their own meager supplies without a second thought. In the face of the kingdom's grand ambitions, their response was one of simple, practical compassion. This stark contrast did not go unnoticed. As the winds howled, the people saw two forms of power at work, one building walls to protect its pride, and the other building shelters to protect its people. The trust earned in that single night forged bonds stronger than any political alliance. Yet the storm's aftermath brought a new kind of tempest. The royal fleet, the symbol of the king's invincible will, lay battered in the harbor, its masts broken and hulls breached. The Eastern counselors were quick to seize the narrative, their voices cutting through the grief and confusion. They declared the storm was no natural event, but a deliberate act of wrath from the powers of the West, a punishment for Numenor's lack of devotion. It was a masterful manipulation, using fear to justify an even more aggressive posture, turning a disaster into a reason for further defiance. Eldar faced this twisted logic with careful precision. Publicly, she spoke to the fishermen and farmers, people who understood the sea's unpredictable nature. She pointed to the known patterns of the weather, the time of year for such gales, framing the storm as a terrible but natural occurrence. This grounded explanation offered solace to those terrified by the idea of vengeful gods and maintained her credibility with practical minds. Privately, however, in the hushed conversations with her council, she acknowledged a deeper truth. The timing was too perfect, the intensity too symbolic. She believed it was a warning, a final plea for reason from the very order the the king was preparing to challenge. This balanced approach allowed her to lead without alienating, to acknowledge the spiritual stakes without succumbing to the panic the advisors were sowing. The kingdom was now fractured along a new, painful line. You either believed the king's narrative of divine persecution, demanding a forceful response, or you saw the storm as a consequence of broken bonds and dangerous pride, a call for humility. This polarization raised the stakes from a war of ideas to the brink of actual conflict, where neighbor might soon turn against neighbor. As the work of clearing debris began under a grim, gray sky, Kalin walked the battered coastline, his eyes scanning the rack line of shattered timber and torn seaweed. There, tangled in the roots of a salt-bleached tree, he found it, a slender, sealed scroll case of a pale, impossibly smooth wood that had somehow survived the ocean's rage. Breaking the seal, he unrolled the message within, its script flowing like captured starlight. It was from the Eldar, and its words were simple, direct, and carried the weight of ages. They spoke of a final chance, a narrow window for reconciliation before the paths between their peoples closed forever. The Elven scroll was not a plea, but a final testament. Laron's script flowed with a terrible clarity, revealing how the shadow in the east fed upon Numenor's own pride, twisting it into a weapon that would seal their doom. His warning was stark, a single, tangible command: seek the haven of the faithful in the northern highlands before the way is lost. For the first time, their desperate hope had a destination, and their fading time had a boundary. The abstract fear of a prophecy was now replaced by the pressing weight of a calendar, each sunrise a page torn away. A fierce debate erupted within their hidden council. Kalin argued for an immediate exodus to the north, to secure the haven and prepare a refuge for those who would listen. To stay in the capital was to risk being caught in the coming storm, he insisted, his voice tight with urgency. Lady Irima countered with the grim logic of the court, her words measured but heavy with dread. If all who remember flee, then the king is left only with the whispers of the shadow. Our presence, even silenced, is a check against his final descent. To abandon the field now is to surrender the kingdom's soul completely. Alara listened to the arguments, the fragile scroll heavy in her hands. She saw the truth in both paths, one of preservation and one of resistance, and understood that choosing one meant sacrificing the other. Yet a single, unwavering thought solidified in her mind: they did not have to choose. We must do both, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. We split our efforts. Some of us will go north to prepare the haven, to ensure a place of safety and a repository for all we have gathered. The rest will remain here, continuing the quiet work, trying to reach the king until the very last moment. It was a painful but necessary division, an acknowledgement that the disaster was now inevitable, but the legacy of Númenor did not have to perish with it. This dual commitment raised the stakes to their highest point yet. They were no longer just trying to avert a catastrophe. They were preparing for its aftermath, fighting to save both people and memory from the coming ruin. The decision made, they moved quickly, a flurry of hushed plans and quiet goodbyes. But as they prepared for the perilous journey north, a royal herald's voice echoed through the city, cutting their preparations short. King Ar-Pharazôn, in a declaration that shook the very foundations of the island, announced his grand armada would set sail for the west, not in seasons, nor in weeks, but within days. The timeline they had dreaded was no longer a distant worry. It was upon them, and the race for the future had suddenly become a desperate sprint. The king's command tore through the island like a gale force. Every seaworthy vessel was summoned to the royal harbor, and a compulsory draft swept up sailors from every village, including those who had found solace in Alara's quiet teachings. The disruption was absolute. Farms were left untended, fishing boats sat empty, and a pervasive fear settled over the people, a dread not just of the unknown western seas, but of the hollowed-out community left behind. For Alara's network, this meant operating in a world turned inside out, where every stranger could be an informant, and every conversation had to be measured against the threat of conscription or arrest. The simple act of guiding someone to safety now felt like threading a needle in a storm. Within this turmoil, a fierce debate erupted among her closest allies. Some argued for a more direct form of resistance. Could they not subtly damage a ship's rigging or contaminate a store of fresh water? Even a small delay might save countless lives from the doomed voyage. The temptation to act, to physically intervene against the tide of pride, was a heavy weight. Alara listened to the arguments, her own heart wrestling with the same visceral urge. But as she watched families torn apart by the draft, she understood that an act of sabotage, however small, would be twisted by the king's counselors into proof of a monstrous conspiracy. It would justify a brutal crackdown, ensuring that everyone associated with their cause, every frightened farmer or weeping mother they had comforted, would be branded a traitor. Their movement would be remembered not for its hope, but for its violence. She made her choice. We will not fight their pride with our own, she told her council, her voice quiet but firm. Our strength has always been in remembrance, not in destruction. To sabotage the fleet would betray the very values we are trying to save. Our path is to rescue, not to ruin. This decision to preserve their moral integrity, even in the face of certain catastrophe, cemented their purpose. It was a choice that aligned their actions with their deepest beliefs, focusing all their remaining energy on the desperate northern exodus. The departure of the Great Armada was a spectacle of terrifying beauty. The sea was a forest of white sails, the air thick with the roar of 1,000 voices, shouting in grim triumph. From a high cliff, Alara watched them go, a solemn witness to the point of no return. The stakes were no longer about influencing the kingdom's path, but about salvaging its soul from the wreckage that was sure to follow. With the fleet vanished over the horizon, an eerie silence fell upon the coast. It was time to move. Alara and her group turned their backs on the sea and began their journey inland, becoming guides for a scattered flock of believers, their footsteps now set toward the rumored safety of the northern highlands. The caravan moved like a slow river through the forgotten valleys of the north, a procession of carts, weary families, and scholars carrying not treasure, but memory. Alara walked at its heart, her eyes constantly scanning the high ridges for any sign of the king's patrols. They kept to paths known only to Kalin and a few trusted rangers, routes hidden by thickets and old rock falls, where the only sounds were the crunch of their own footsteps and the lowing of the oxen. To keep fear at bay, they shared stories as they walked. An elder would recount a tale of the first star to guide a Númenorian ship, and a child would hum the melody from the city square. the tunes weaving a fragile shield against the pressing silence of the wilderness. Their shared purpose became a tangible force, a warmth that held back the chill of the unknown. The journey was a relentless test of endurance. A sudden rockslide blocked a crucial pass, costing them a full day to clear a narrow, treacherous path. A fever swept through the children, forcing them to make camp by a bitter stream until the worst had passed. Each delay was a fresh weight on Alara's shoulders, the precious days slipping through her fingers like sand. The most critical decision came at a fork in the old trail. Kalin laid out the choice with a ranger's grim practicality. The eastern path was longer, winding through difficult but unpopulated highlands. The western route was shorter by several days, but it skirted the edge of a royal garrison, a place crawling with the king's soldiers. The group looked to Alara. The scholar who had once risked everything for a single tablet now held the lives of hundreds in her hands. The temptation of speed was immense, a siren call promising to outrun the doom they all felt gathering. But as she looked at the faces around her, the tired parents, the old woman clutching a bundle of sacred herbs, the young scholar who had copied her every journal entry, she knew there was no choice. Speed meant gambling with every life in their care. "We take the longer road," she said, her voice calm and firm, a tone she had learned from leading, not from studying. The safety of the group is our only priority. It was a decision that cost them time they could not afford, but it cemented her transformation. She was no longer just a seeker of truth. She was a guardian of the people who carried it. Every sunrise they did not travel felt like a failure. Each sunset a countdown to an unimaginable end. The responsibility was a physical pressure on her chest, a constant, whispering dread that her caution might yet deliver them all into the very cataclysm they fled. As they finally descended into the green, sheltered valley, rumored to be the haven, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the caravan. They had made it. But as they looked back toward the western horizon, seeking the sea, they saw it. The sky was darkening, not with the soft hues of dusk, but with a deep, bruising purple, and a low, persistent tremor began to hum through the soles of their boots, a vibration that spoke not of the earth, but of its breaking. The hidden bay was a cradle of calm, its waters a deep, still blue cradled by high cliffs, ancient stone docks, worn smooth by centuries of gentle waves, reached into the shallows like the welcoming arms of the land itself. There was no time for awe. The moment the last refugee stumbled onto the pebbled shore, the work began. Alara directed the strongest to clear old pathways choked with thorny brush, while others started raising simple shelters from the timber that grew thick on the hillsides. The old Elven built structures, elegant pavilions of pale stone that seemed to grow from the earth, were carefully restored, their open arches once again framing views of the peaceful cove. Within days, the haven was no longer a hiding place, but a village. The air hummed with the sounds of industry, the rhythmic chop of axes, the chatter of communal cooking fires, the laughter of children playing in a stream. It was a small, vibrant bastion of the old values, a living memory of what Númenor had been before its pride. But this fragile hope was soon tested. Their carefully gathered supplies, so vast when loaded on carts, dwindled alarmingly fast when divided among hundreds of mouths. A sharp disagreement erupted between the fishermen, who needed rope and nets, and the builders, who required the same materials for reinforcing roofs before the weather turned. Voices were raised, old suspicions between city dwellers and farmers surfaced, and the unity they had forged on the trail began to fray. Alara watched the conflict, her heart heavy. She knew a leader who commanded would only echo the very authority they had fled. That evening, she gathered everyone and proposed a new way. "We will form a council," she announced, with one voice chosen from each family group. "Every need will be heard, and every decision will be made together." This was not a decree from a scholar, but an invitation from a fellow survivor. Her commitment to collaborative governance transformed the tension. The council argued. They debated late into the night, but they eventually reached a compromise that honored all their needs. This small act of shared rule strengthened their community more than any stockpile of supplies ever could. The haven was now more than a refuge. It was the last living seed of Numenor's true legacy. Its success meant that a part of their culture, their knowledge, and their connection to the wider world might endure. Its failure, or its discovery by a royal patrol, would mean the utter annihilation of everything they had worked to preserve. The weight of an entire civilization now rested on the security of this single, hidden bay. High on the cliffs, the watchmen scanned the horizon endlessly, their eyes straining against the glare of the sea. Then one afternoon, a cry went up. A young ranger pointed a trembling finger westward. There, on the very edge of the world, was a faint smudge of white. It was the king's fleet, a vast armada of proud sails, driving with unwavering purpose, not away from, but directly into the heart of the gathering storm. The sea did not simply rage, it rose. Through the far-seeing glass, the world's edge became a chaos of collapsing water and splintered wood. The king's proud fleet, a forest of white sails moments before, was swallowed by waves that dwarfed mountains, a cataclysm that made the very air vibrate with a deafening roar. There was no battle, only an immense and terrible erasure. The prophecy was no longer a warning etched in stone. It was a reality unfolding before their eyes, confirming every fear they had carried from the silent library to this desperate shore. A collective gasp turned into a wail of horror from the refugees behind Alara. The sight shattered the fragile hope they had built in their new home, replacing it with a raw, consuming grief. Panic threatened to surge through the crowd, a tide as dangerous as the one devouring the western coast. Alara felt the despair clawing at her own heart, the weight of thousands of lives lost in a single, prideful moment. But to let that grief paralyze them now would be a second downfall. She turned from the horrifying vista, her face pale, but her voice clear and steady, as she called for everyone to gather close. She did not offer empty words of comfort or promises of safety. Instead, she began to sing. It was the same melody from the city square, the old refrain of starlight and voices on the wind, but now its notes were a balm for a broken people. One by one, the refugees joined her, their voices shaky at first, then growing stronger, weaving a tapestry of shared memory that held back the crushing weight of the present. This was not a song of victory, but a song of remembrance, a choice to honor what had been lost rather than be destroyed by the manner of its passing. In that moment, the haven transformed. It was no longer just a refuge, it was a sacred trust, the final vessel carrying the living memory of an entire civilization. Its preservation was no longer a matter of survival, but a solemn duty, to all who had perished. As the last monstrous waves began to recede into a bruised and unnatural calm, a deep tremor passed through the ground beneath their feet, a shudder that ran through the very bones of the island. Then a new and more subtle horror began. The sea itself, which had moments before been a raging wall of destruction, began to pull away from the northern shores, its waters withdrawing with a low, sucking groan, exposing vast stretches of seabed that had not seen the sun in ages. The water did not simply recede, it fled. Before the stunned eyes of the refugees, the sea pulled away from their sheltered bay with a low, terrible groan, exposing a naked expanse of dark, glistening seabed they were never meant to see. Their docks now reached over bare stone and stranded seaweed, a cruel mockery of the deep water sanctuary they had relied upon for escape. A wave of panicked cries erupted. "We are trapped," a woman shrieked, her voice cutting through the rising fear. "The king's doom has found us even here." The solid ground of their hope was crumbling as quickly as the coastline, replaced by the terrifying prospect of being cornered in a dying refuge. Elara moved through the chaos, her own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She raised her hands, her voice cutting through the din, not with a shout, but with a forced, steady calm. "Look at the cliffs," she called out, pointing to the high ground surrounding the bay. "The water is gone, but the land remains. We have faced the end of the world, and we are still here. Our path forward is the same as it has always been, together." Her words were a lifeline, and the crowd, grasping for any shred of stability, slowly quieted, their frightened eyes fixed on her. A fierce debate immediately erupted among her council. "We must abandon the bay now," Kalin urged, his gaze scanning the exposed, alien landscape. "We take what we can carry and make for the high passes before we are completely boxed in." Another elder shook his head, his face etched with a weary stubbornness. "This is a sign, a test of faith. The sea gifted us this haven, and the sea will return. To flee now is to abandon our only sure source of water and food. We would be walking into a barren wilderness to die of thirst." Elara listened, weighing the terror of the unknown against the peril of inaction. To move hundreds of people, including the elderly and the very young, without knowing the condition of the routes ahead was a monumental risk. To stay, hoping against the evidence of their own eyes, was a gamble with their very survival. She made her choice with a leader's painful pragmatism. "Kalin, take your swiftest scouts," she commanded. "Go, assess the high ground, find us a viable path, not just an escape route, but a place where we could potentially resettle if we must. The rest of us will not wait idly. We will secure everything, move the boats to the highest possible ground, tie down the shelters, and gather all supplies into the strongest elven structures. We prepare for the sea's return, whatever form it may take." This dual command was a masterstroke of crisis management, addressing both the immediate fear of entrapment and the looming, unspoken threat of what happens when an ocean flees with such force. It channeled their panic into purposeful, life-saving labor. The frantic work began, a race against a clock they could not see. As the scouts vanished into the cliffs, and the community worked to batten down their fragile new home, the tension was a physical weight. Their preparedness was being tested, not by an army, but by the planet itself, and the very geography of their sanctuary was rewriting its own rules around them. It was a test of their faith in each other, and in the future they were trying to build from the ashes of the past. just as the scouts returned, their faces grim but nodding confirmation of a difficult but passable route inland. A new sound began. It started as a distant rumble, then grew into a deep, deafening roar that shook the very air. All work ceased. Every face turned toward the empty bay. And there, on the horizon, a dark line appeared, growing with impossible speed into a towering wall of water, the sea's furious answer to their fleeting hope. The roar became the only sound in the world, a wall of water taller than the highest cliff, blotting out the sky. Ilara's voice cut through the paralyzing fear, a single, sharp command, echoing the drills they had practiced. To the high ground now, the path Kalin's scouts had found became a river of desperate motion. She moved not as a leader giving orders from afar, but as a shepherd of her people, her hands pulling the elderly to their feet, her arms scooping up a sobbing child to carry. Kalin and his rangers were the rear guard, their sharp eyes scanning, their strong arms guiding the stragglers, ensuring the human current did not leave a single soul behind. They reached the summit just as the wave struck the cove. The impact was a deafening crash of collapsing stone and shattering timber. The ancient docks they had restored vanished in an instant, their carefully gathered food stores and tools swept away in the churning, frothing chaos. The lower basin of their haven was scoured clean, but the people, breathless and clinging to one another, were safe on the cliffs. In the stunned silence that followed the wave's retreat, a new sound pierced the air, a mother's frantic cry. "My daughter." Ilara followed the woman's terrified gaze to the flooded ruins below, where a small, pale face was visible, trapped in the branches of a half-submerged tree. The water was still swirling, treacherous and deep, and the stability of the ground was an unknown peril. Every logical thought screamed for caution, for sending a ranger, for weighing the risk of one against the safety of the many. But the child's terrified eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, the scholar who analyzed risk was gone. There was only the guardian. Without a word, she plunged down the muddy slope, the cold water swallowing her legs, then her waist, as she fought the powerful current. Her commitment was no longer an abstract ideal. It was a physical act, a desperate wade through the wreckage of their world to reach a single, small life. Pulling the shivering girl from the grasping branches, she held her close, a human anchor against the relentless pull of the water as she struggled back to the higher ground. That single, selfless act, witnessed by every survivor, forged a bond stronger than any council decree. Ilara was no longer just their guide. She was the heart of their community, the living proof that every individual mattered. Yet her bravery came with a devastating strategic cost. As the waters finally stilled into a sickening, debris-choked calm, they looked upon the bay. Their boats, their only means of escape from a dying island, were gone, smashed into splinters. They were now truly trapped, their fate tied irrevocably to the land itself. And that land was coming apart. From their high perch, they watched in horrified silence as great fissures opened along the northern coastline, swallowing entire forests into the groaning earth. The distant mountains to the south seemed to slump into the sea. The world was breaking its own bones. Their planned overland escape routes were vanishing before their eyes, collapsing into the abyss. Their hope now rested on a thread of starlight, on the memory of a promise carried by the wind, and on the slender, desperate faith that the elven ships they had once dared to hope for would find them before the island consumed itself entirely. Through the churning mist, shapes emerged that were not of the drowning world. The elven ships cut through the strange new channels carved by the cataclysm, their prows slicing the foam with an otherworldly grace. They were a vision from the oldest stories, made real in the moment of Númenor's greatest need. The rescue was a quiet, efficient ballet of ropes and strong, outstretched hands, a poignant union of ancient friendship and desperate, practical action. Yet, as the first longboats came near the cliff, a murmur of fear ran through the refugees. Years of the king's propaganda had done their work, painting these saviors as distant, untrustworthy spirits. One man pulled his child back from the edge, his face a mask of deep suspicion. Alara moved swiftly through the crowd, her voice calm but firm. "They are not our jailers," she reminded them. "They are the keepers of the very bonds we fought to remember. They have crossed a broken sea to find us." Her certainty, forged in libraries and hidden shrines, became the bridge their fear would not cross. She worked alongside Laron, their communication a blend of gesture and shared purpose, directing the evacuation with a quiet urgency as the island groaned beneath them. When the last of her people were safely in the boats, Alara stood alone on the precipice. The choice was instinctive, a final act of guardianship. She would not board until she was certain not a single soul remained behind. It was a decision that cemented her legacy, not as a scholar, but as the heart of her people. This exodus was the ultimate validation of their entire struggle. The land was being erased, its towers and forests swallowed by the unforgiving sea, but its soul was being saved, carried in the hearts of the survivors. As the elven ship caught the wind, Alara stood at the rail, her gaze fixed on the western horizon. One by one, the last proud peaks of Númenor vanished beneath the waves, a sight of immense and sorrowful finality. The home she had known was gone, but on the deck around her, a new future breathed, a testament to the fragile, enduring power of memory against the crushing weight of pride. What world would they build from the echoes of the old? The air in the elf havens smelled of pine and cold, clear streams, a sharp contrast to the salt and ruin they had left behind. Under the graceful, melding boughs of the Eldar, the refugees of Númenor were met not with pity, but with a profound, shared sorrow. The elves offered them shelter in Talon, built among the ancient trees and clearings where the stars seemed closer, a gentle welcome that acknowledged the depth of their loss. The work of building a new life was slow and deliberate, a daily practice of weaving their two cultures together. Númenorian stonemasons, their hands accustomed to raising mighty towers, now learned to shape rock in harmony with the contours of the land, while elven lore keepers shared the subtle languages of the forest, teaching them to read the signs in the weather and the growth of plants. This integration was not a surrender of their identity, but its expansion, a blending of deep-rooted memory with timeless wisdom. Yet the shadow of their drowned home was a constant, quiet companion. Grief did not arrive as a single, crushing wave, but in small, unexpected moments. A familiar melody hummed by a child would cause a mother to turn away, her eyes bright with tears, or the scent of a particular herb would bring a craftsman's hands to a sudden halt, lost in the memory of a distant shore. The community's greatest challenge was not building homes, but mending hearts, a test of whether their hard-won unity could withstand the slow, eroding tide of sorrow. In the heart of this new settlement, Eldar made a decision that would define their future. She gathered the few precious journals she had saved, their pages salted and worn, and laid them on a simple wooden table. This would not be enough, she realized. A personal record was a fragile vessel for an entire civilization. She announced her intention to create a great archive, a collective memory of all they had been. She sought out every survivor, from the oldest elder to the youngest apprentice, inviting them to share not just the grand histories, but the everyday stories, the recipes for long-lost dishes, the designs of their ships, the lullabies sung in coastal villages, the very cadence of a world that was no more. Her personal quest had transformed into a communal mission, a sacred duty to ensure that Númenor would live on in more than just name. The survival of their culture now rested on this fragile, living chain of remembrance. Each story told, each song learned by a new generation, was a victory against the finality of the sea. It was a quiet responsibility, without the drama of fleeing guards or raging storms, but its weight was immense, for they were now the sole keepers of a light that had once illuminated the world. As seasons turned in the sheltered havens, the community began to flourish. Their settlement, a blend of elegant Elven design and sturdy Númenorian craft, became a place of quiet scholarship and renewed purpose. The tales of their perilous journey and the founding of this refuge slowly wove themselves into the local lore, a whispered legend among the woods and hills. This new chapter was not an end, but a different kind of beginning, a seed of hope carefully planted in the rich soil of Middle-earth, its roots reaching deep into a past it vowed never to forget. The first stones of the archive were laid not with mortar, but with memory. Under Eldar's direction, the clearing became a hive of quiet industry, where the ringing of masons' tools blended with the soft scratch of quills. The building rose, a graceful structure of pale stone and living wood, its design a perfect marriage of Númenorian strength and Elven harmony. Within its halls, a sacred labor began. Scribes who had once copied royal decrees now bent over salvaged scraps of vellum, meticulously transcribing the fragments of lore they had carried in their minds and hearts. They worked beside storytellers whose voices brought the dry words to life, ensuring the cadence and emotion of the old tales were not lost to the silent page. This archive was more than a library. It was a soul, a living testament to a civilization that refused to be silenced by the sea. Word of this beacon of knowledge spread slowly at first, carried on the tongues of traveling elves and wandering dwarven traders. Then others began to arrive, scholars from distant human settlements, drawn by whispers of a lost wisdom, journeyed for months to study the star charts and ship lore. Adventurers seeking to understand the older world found maps that spoke of forgotten paths and alliances. The archive became a crossroads, a place where the fractured knowledge of Middle-earth could begin to knit itself back together, all under the enduring symbol of the white tree carved above its great doors. This very prominence, however, made it a gleaming target in a shadowed age. Not all who came sought understanding. Some sought to control or erase the truths held within. Rumors spoke of agents in the night, of those who would see the old alliances permanently broken and this new light extinguished. Eldar understood that ink and parchment were vulnerable. A single fire, an act of malice, could wipe out centuries of memory in an instant. To guard against this, she made a profound decision. She instituted a new tradition, one that wove the written word with the living voice. Each evening, as the sun set, the great hall would fill. There, elders would share the stories not from books, but from their own lived experience, their voices giving weight to the history. The children were not merely listeners, they were participants, encouraged to ask questions and to learn the tales by heart. This ensured the knowledge lived in two places at once, on the durable page and in the breath of the people, creating a defense that no flame could ever fully destroy. The preservation of this cultural continuity became their greatest shield and their most perilous burden. The archive was now the heart of their identity, the one place on earth where the true story of Númenor was kept alive. This made it a threat to any power built on ignorance or fear, a prize for those who served the lingering shadow in the east. The community's vigil was a quiet, constant war, fought not with swords, but with watchful eyes and steadfast hearts. The stakes were the future itself, for if the archive fell, the last living bridge to the old world would be shattered, leaving the ages to come with only echoes and lies. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Alara walked the sun-dappled paths between the archive halls, a young woman approached her. The girl's hands were stained with ink, and her eyes held the same bright, hungry curiosity that had once driven a young scholar into a forbidden library. "I have learned all the scribes can teach me of the letters," she said, her voice a mixture of reverence and resolve. "But I wish to learn the stories as you heard them, from the world before. Will you tell me of the singing caves?" Alara looked at this new generation, so eager to take up the mantle of remembrance, and felt a profound peace settle over her. The work would not end with her. The circle was unbroken. Her hands, once used to trace forbidden symbols on ancient stone, now guided a young apprentice's over a fresh sheet of parchment. Alara watched as the girl carefully formed the flowing script that told of the white tree, her movements still uncertain, but her intent unwavering. This was the heart of her work now, not in the grand archive halls, but in the quiet shade of the teaching groves. She taught the histories, yes, but she wove through them the deeper lessons, the quiet strength found in helping a wounded fox, the courage to sing an old song in a hostile square, the profound humility of accepting that one person cannot control the tides of fate. These were the values that had saved them, and they were the legacy she was determined to pass on. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her students began to shoulder more of the community's weight. A young man who had been a child during the Exodus now organized the distribution of supplies with a calm efficiency that rivaled her own. The girl with the ink-stained hands began to lead the evening storytelling sessions, her voice finding its own unique rhythm as she shared the tales. Alara felt a familiar tension stir within her, a protective urge to step in, to correct a minor detail or suggest a different approach. Letting go of the reins she had held so tightly for so long was a personal struggle far greater than any she had faced with the king's guards. It was a test of faith, not in their knowledge but in their character, a belief that the seeds she had planted would grow according to their own design, not hers. After a long period of reflection, she made a conscious and deliberate choice. She would step back from the daily administration of the settlement and the archive. Her new purpose would be to write her personal account, a first-hand narrative of the downfall and the Exodus, a companion to the official histories that would preserve the heart behind the events. This transition was vital for the long-term survival of their mission, ensuring that leadership was a flame passed from one torch to the next, not a solitary light that would one day flicker and die. Yet it was an emotional passage, an acknowledgement that her direct influence would inevitably fade, replaced by the fresh perspectives and new interpretations of those who had only known Númenor as a story. Walking through the lush gardens of the settlement one evening, the scent of night-blooming flowers mixing with the sound of young voices debating in the archive, she felt a deep and settled peace. The work was not finished, but her part in its most active chapter was. The tales of Númenor and the soul within them were in good hands. The sea wind pulled at Alara's cloak, tasting of salt and strange shores. In her palm, she cradled a small pouch of dark, rich earth, the last physical remnant of a world now resting beneath the waves. The ritual felt necessary, a final act of speech for a home that could no longer answer. As she stepped to the water's edge, the weight of the soil was a profound anchor, a tangible piece of every street she had walked, every library shelf she had touched, every life that had been lost. This was not just dirt, it was memory made solid, and letting it go felt like a second drowning. Her people watched from the tree line, their silent presence a mirror to her own conflict, their collective grief held in her single, outstretched hand. She had led them to safety, built a new home from hope and shared labor, yet this personal farewell to the land itself remained the last uncrossed bridge in her own heart. To scatter this earth was to accept, finally and completely, that the past was beyond her reach. The scholar in her, the keeper of records, rebelled against the act, seeing it as a surrender of the very history she had sworn to preserve. How could she honor Númenor by letting the last of its substance slip through her fingers? But the leader she had become understood a deeper truth. Holding on too tightly to the ashes would only blind her to the needs of the living community behind her, the people who looked to her not for a monument to grief, but for a path forward. The stakes in this quiet moment were as vast as the ocean before her. It was a choice between being defined by loss or being guided by legacy. With a slow, deliberate motion, she opened her hand and let the soil fall. The dark grains scattered on the surface of the water, swirling for a moment in the current before vanishing into the depths. It was not a surrender, but a release, a conscious decision to plant the memory of Númenor not in the earth of a lost island, but in the deeds and hearts of its survivors. The act was a bridge, connecting her profound love for what was lost to her unwavering commitment to what could be. She did not turn her back on the sea, but she finally turned her full attention to the sounds of life coming from the settlement, the laughter of children who knew Númenor only as a story, the hammering of craftsmen building a future. Her journey had taught her that true preservation is not about clutching relics, but about nurturing the living spirit that those relics represent. In letting the soil go, she was not abandoning her home, she was finally bringing its essence home to her people. The years softened the lines of worry on Alara's face, replacing them with the gentle creases of a life lived in purpose. She walked through the settlement not as its frantic guardian, but as its most revered elder, her steps slow and measured along paths she had once helped to clear. The hum of the community was her constant music, the rhythmic clang of the smithy, the distant chorus from the teaching groves where a new generation learned the old scripts, the laughter of children who knew the name Númenor only as the origin of their favorite bedtime stories. Her personal journey had come full circle. The solitary scholar, who had risked everything for a single truth, now surrounded by the living, breathing results of that risk. Her contentment was not found in a lack of challenge, but in the deep, resonant satisfaction of seeing the seed she had nurtured grow into a forest. The archive stood as a testament to their past, but the people were the testament to their future. She had evolved from a keeper of records to a planter of seeds, and now she had the privilege of resting in their shade. The world had irrevocably changed, the island kingdom lost to the deep, but in the shared meals, the combined festivals with the elves, and the very layout of their streets, the best qualities of their lost home lived on. There was a profound emotional closure in this, a quiet certainty that every hardship, every moment of terror, had not been in vain. Their efforts had ensured that the soul of their culture was not a ghost, but a guiding light. Yet, this peace was not passive. A subtle, ongoing struggle remained in the constant vigilance required to protect their legacy. Rumors still drifted from the east, whispers of a shadow that had not been fully dispelled, a reminder that the preservation of light was a perpetual duty. The community's watchmen remained on the cliffs, their eyes now trained not for royal ships, but for any sign of the old malice seeking to extinguish their new light. The tales of Númenor were safe, but safety itself was a condition that required nurturing, a garden that must always be tended. The story ends not with an ending, but with a quiet exhale, a sense of continuity that stretches forward into time. The specific whispers of a drowned island had slowly woven themselves into the larger tapestry of Middle-earth's history, their lessons of pride and remembrance, of friendship and resilience, becoming threads in a greater story. Ilara's part was complete, her wisdom passed down like a cherished heirloom, and as the evening star glittered above the tranquil havens, one could almost hear the echo of the old melodies on the wind, a gentle, everlasting reminder that what is truly remembered never truly dies.